Welcome everyone. Today we are going to be making the pattern Simplicity 9742 Dress A. Let's get into it. And of course we are going to start with cutting our pattern pieces out. I have these marked out onto pattern paper because I made a few modifications to the pattern, and the kind of pattern paper that I have is really good for actually just tailoring the pattern without making a mock-up, which I find to be much preferable. I could probably show it the next time I fit a pattern. But another method that I'm employing here is I marked 5/8 of an inch in on all the corners of my pattern pieces, and I will mark that down on the fabric and then just move the pattern piece back so it kind of matches that and creates the sew line 5/8 of an inch in. I find it to be a nice and easy way of marking your seam line. And I started sewing by making a corset, so I find it necessary and I cannot break the habit. Start pinning the pattern pieces together. You'll see that this is one of the few times that I actually even use pins in this project. I've started using quilting clips, and I would say if you can use them, do. Why poke holes in your fabric and mess around with pins when you don't need to? Now we can start sewing the lining of the bodice together. You'll notice that at some point I realized that I did not stay stitch anywhere that I needed to stay stitch. Make sure you do that, preferably before you start pinning things together so you can actually pin everything together. It is important. Don't skip it, especially if you have princess seams or curved seams. Do your stay stitching. You will suffer if you don't. Stay stitching, I'm just notching along the curves. These really aren't that extreme of curves, but the first time I made this pattern I had a really hard time, so I'm going a little overboard here. Sew those curved seams together, and one of the things you want to look out for is any creases along your seam. If you do get a crease, just take that part of the seam out and straighten it out, sew it more carefully, and keep doing it till it's flat. Here's another good learning moment. For me, I didn't really realize the importance of ironing and finishing your seams when I first started sewing. You want to do it, and you want to do it as you go. Like, finish the segment that you're working on, iron the seam open, and finish it. It's really hard to justify spending extra time just finishing the inside of the garment, but it's worth your time. It'll make it just a better quality garment, and it'll make it last longer. So I think with these, I don't finish them immediately, but I end up just flat felling them to one side. Now is a good time to mention the changes that I'm making to this pattern. I'm adding a lining, and I'm adding interfacing and boning to the shell of the garment, so you do not have to do that. Honestly, I don't even know how much it added to mine, so unless you really want it to look structured and corseted, you can skip this and just follow the pattern instructions. But here I'm going to cut out the interfacing for the shell. Here I'm kind of applying the interfacing in one big batch. I'm gonna basically throw a piece of fabric down, soak the whole thing, and just move the iron over it for way too long until they are fused. Really proud of myself here for remembering to stay stitch before I pinned anything together. Great job, team. So I'm not going to show you sewing the shell together because it's the same exact process as the lining. Here I'm applying the boning channels. I got pre-cased boning because I already had it. So I'm basically cutting the channels to length and then applying a dissolvable tape over the seam, the finished seam, that I flat felled on each side rather than just folding it over to one side like I did with the lining. And after everything is all taped down, this dissolves in the washing machine, by the way. It's also really, really handy for zippers. I highly recommend it. But after it's all taped down, I'm just going to sew the boning channels in on each side. If you're going to backstitch at the bottom, like you'll see me do here in a second, make sure you do it below your seam allowance, not above. Another rookie mistake is not rounding out the ending of your boning if you're using plastic boning. Just file it down or burn it or whatever, but if you don't do it, it'll break through the channels and you will be very sad after wearing the garment. Alright, now we're moving on to the skirt. The first thing I'm going to do is overlock the inner edge of the pockets. Full disclosure, I'm making a circle skirt instead of the skirt that came with this pattern. You can do either. I just didn't feel like doing box pleats and I really like circle skirts and I wanted to make a circle skirt of this length. So attaching the pockets onto the dress, I usually do it 1.5 inches down from the seam allowance of the waistline. Now I'm just sewing them on and ironing them flat. To do inseam pockets, you want to put right side to right side of your skirt panels and then have the pockets coming out from there, and you just pin along that and basically sew along the outer edge. Now that I have my pockets installed, I'm just going to iron the seam flat and I'm going to slice up the middle. If you're following the pattern exactly, you don't have to do that part because you'll have 2 separate panels. method I talked about earlier of marking 5/8 of an inch in on the pattern, you can see where I'm marking it on the fabric so I can trace in my seam allowance. Also, I'd like to apologize for the weird stop motion of these clips for the next minute or so. I realized that it was taking up way too much RAM to edit this video if I was actually just speeding up the full-length video clips, so I decided to start using time-lapse, and this is me using the auto feature instead of using like 10 times or 5 times, which I later figured out was the better move. So after gathering down the bottom edge of the yoke, I am pinning some bias tape to the sleeve hem. I also realized here that I didn't finish the shoulder seam, so halfway through you're going to see me stop to do that. Once I have that sewn down, I trim the seam bulk, and then I'm going to flip it up and sew it back down. Here it is. This is why I talked about finishing your seams earlier. If you wait until the last moment, it's going to be really annoying when you could have just done it when you finished sewing them together in the first place. This part is always really satisfying to me. You have to kind of like lay down the lining and the shell with the yoke in a way that like I can't explain to you how I figure out how they fit together. I just move them around and I like sandwich them together the way they're supposed to be when they're right side out, and then I flip it inside out from there, and then every single time it works, I'm so impressed with myself. Adding a lining to this bodice is tricky, so basically, you know, I tried to understitch it and it didn't work out. So just trim your seam and trim it as well as you can, and then iron it flat, and hopefully that should create a nice looking seam. Here comes the exciting part when it actually starts to feel like you're gonna make a dress out of a project. First, I'm just, ironing a little bit to make it neater on the inside before I pin everything down. And now we are sewing the bodice to the skirt. Ah, yeah, woo. This is a good time to mention that I'm absolutely terrified of the rotary cutter. It's such a good tool, but it's so scary. I'm terrified of it. To finish off this seam, we're just going to overlock it and then iron it. Now that we have the skirt attached to the bodice, we're just making sure she fits, and now we are going to work on the collar first and then the placket. I decided to first iron the long seam of the collar so I could understitch it and then do the side seams, because I found that I can't get in the corners, so I'd rather have one side completely understitched than have 3 sides poorly understitched, if that makes sense. And I'm just trimming the seam allowance in the corners once I have that done. Once I have all 3 sides stitched, I'm ironing them, and I use random things as a clapper, so that's why I had poker chips. Now we are moving on to the placket. Off camera, I ironed on the interfacing and then just ironed it folded straight up in half. Now I'm pinning it right side to right side against the front of the dress, and here's where I realized that I didn't make the placket long enough. This whole sequence kind of really beautifully outlines what I love and hate about sewing. It's really easy to make mistakes, but it's oftentimes also pretty easy to fix them. Sometimes it's a lot more of a pain than others, but this one wasn't too bad. It's kind of hard to see what's going on here, but basically you fold the placket inside out and you pin it together where the markings are, and you end up having a little cutout at the top of the placket to mesh with the collar. Do not make the same mistake as me. I sewed it way too close to the seam of the placket. Don't do that, your life's going to be easier. Give yourself like at least half a centimeter, if not more. Here I'm just trimming off the excess from that little thing. Again, I made it way too close to the seam, and that became really apparent when I was trying to iron it shut. It just didn't look very good, so someone else might know how to do that better than me. Alright, I did some math to accommodate for my obnoxiously large buttons and respaced them and then marked it on the pattern, and now I'm just marking that on the dress. For this next part, I realized that if I wanted to not button the dress up all the way and have the collar fold back, that I would need to add panels to hide the white inside of the fabric. So that's what I'm doing here. I ended up having to seam rip part of the placket, but you know, it was worth it, even though it took a really long time and hurt my back. I think it definitely looks good. We're getting there. Now we are pinning on the collar. Yay! Side sewn on, now we have to pin on the second side. This is similar to the placket where you stitch in the ditch. I had the absolute worst time with these buttonholes. This was like my 3rd attempt to make this freaking thing work, and it finally did, so like, you don't need to see the struggle. This is my favorite part of buttons. I hate the rest though. I debated whether I wanted to actually show you sewing on more than one button, so I found a compromise. I don't want this video to be super long. Adding a little bit of elastic to the back of the waistband because I wanted it to fit a little bit tighter. And now we're almost done. We're moving on to the hem, which I decided that I wanted to try a new thing with bias tape instead of just hemming and folding and ironing, where I just folded the bias tape in half over it. If you do this, do double wide bias tape and do a 3-step zigzag to attach it. All those points where you see me seam ripping is places where my single line of stitching fell out and I had to redo with a zigzag.